So, I'd like to begin by suggesting that gifted education is a field of education that's often proved to be quite divisive. And perhaps it's an acceptance that not all students begin from an equal starting point. Perhaps that challenges our conceptions of what an educational system is and what it's for, the sort of broad democratic educational project that we've embarked on in the post-industrial age, and also to do with some of these conceptions of fairness that have been built into that. Perhaps it's our understanding as teachers that students have pre-existing gifts provides a challenge to us and our outmoded conception that we may have that we are the font of all knowledge. And perhaps the demands it makes on us as teachers is at times inconvenient. The fact that we have to do something out of the ordinary, exceptional for students who have gifts, and that is demanding, can prove challenging to us. I'd like to suggest that it's proved to be a field of education that is divisive, and also it's a field of education that possibly because of that has been riddled with misinformation and myths, and that these myths that are peddled and have been peddled over a period of time have come to become internalized within our education system, so much so that they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. We end up planning our provision of gifted education around what we believe to be what gifted education is and what giftedness actually means, rather than what it really is. So in this presentation, I want to address this idea of myths. The idea that myths that I believe tend to become true, as Orwell says here, is something that pertains very, very clearly in the field of gifted education. I want to address specifically three particular myths that I think have been long held within the field of gifted education. The first of which is that gifted education is synonymous with high IQ or high attainment. The second is that it's fair to teach all students in the same way. And the third is that the acceleration of gifted students is harmful for their social and personal development. So let's start with the first myth, a commonly held myth that giftedness equates with IQ, which is of course an abstract measure that's constituted of measures of cognitive ability, amongst other things, memory, abstract reasoning, visual, spatial, and verbal and non-verbal reasoning. This myth perhaps exists and continues to exist because in its infancy, gifted education had a strong focus on IQ as a marker of giftedness. In her paper, A Resuscitation of Gifted Education, Jolly documents the early history of gifted education and how in post-war America, an interest in gifted education spurred out of a need to establish a pipeline of talent, I suppose, that would provide a brains trust that would secure the US's national security interests and win the space race in the post-war Cold War. And it was deemed that a rarefied kind of level of intelligence was central to this. So this conception was that giftedness giftedness was entirely based on the idea of IQ and a very selective notion of that as well. So Hollingworth's definition of giftedness at the time was defined as superior intelligence of a score of IQ of 130 or above, and comprising about 1% of children, and others went even further, 140% or an IQ of 140 according to Terman. Perhaps the reason that there was this focus on IQ was because at this point this was really the only quantifiable measurement we had, and the only sort of testable element of intelligence that we had at this point in time. But over time there was a growing realization that testing of IQ was never culturally neutral and had certain cultural biases, and that wasn't a true reflection of ability. And of course the work of Guilford and others, psychologists, a growing number of psychologists, begin to recognize that intelligence was in fact multidimensional, not just this singular conception of IQ. So moving on here, we have a sense of a broadening out, and also, I suppose, a widening of the parameters of what may or may not be gifted. So for instance, James Conant begins to define those in the top 15 to 20% of IQ as being those deemed were, appropriate for kind of extension measures within school. The historical origins of the IQ myth don't seem to have prevented it from persisting. That's not to say that cognitive testing is not an important, significant tool in identifying students with gifts. We use ACER and Orwell testing as a core indicator in the school, and rightly so. It's appropriate and useful. It's important to recognise, though, as Borden does in his paper, that IQ is a social construct, as indeed the arbitrary marks we attach to ACER and Orwell testing. They're not observable natural phenomenon. So a cut-off point that we may use to distinguish those students who are gifted and those who are not is always a sort of arbitrary and imaginary line in the sand that we should be a little bit wary of. It's useful, but it's not a definitive cut-off point. We should be mindful that this form of testing also often privileges those from certain cultural backgrounds, and it may not be a universally consistent measure. That's certainly true of IQ. So we shouldn't think that cognitive measures are the only factors here as well. As regards that arbitrary line in the sand and where one draws the line, we've moved, I suppose, from a quite selective small percentage of students. Early indications, Borden cites a persistent 3 to 5% mythical figure that was bandied around it early on. In reality, there's little to suggest that those in the top 5 IQ-wise are more or less inclined to develop talents than those in the top 20% or so. If you look at real-world research, it says how people have developed talents in the real world. They're not necessarily those just in the 5% of cognitive ability. Renzulli, in his definition, suggested above average intelligence, but no more than above average intelligence, is a prerequisite for gifted. By this he means specifically 15 to 20% or so, but that's quite a broad parameter. Our own policy uses as a rule of thumb the marker set by Gagne. This is not cast iron, but 10 to 15% of an average population being gifted is the sort of relatively line in the sand that we use as a guide, not a cast iron rule. But beyond this has been a growing recognition it's not just about cognitive ability or intelligence and so on. So we see here in front of us Renzulli's free ring model, which was influential from the 70s onwards as well. It suggests that giftedness is a composite of three distinct and overlapping tendencies. All three need to be present for Renzulli for giftedness to occur. There is, as we mentioned a minute ago, above average ability, by which we mean cognitive ability here as well. But coming into the mix for the first time, and recognition of the importance of creativity. That's highly significant. So let's think, and this was perhaps in part because around about this time in the 70s, we first started to get tests such as a Torrance testing that could give a reliable indicator of creativity. We don't necessarily use those tests in school. Perhaps we should. Perhaps we need to look at that as well. But if you think of those students whom we might identify as creative, they're often students who are on our register. I'm thinking of someone like Anton here, who's been recently awarded for his photography. He's a highly accomplished musician, and so on. But we shouldn't just think of creativity as being in the creative arts and so on. Another student like Alex in year 10, who demonstrates a high degree of creativity in the way that he approaches problems in science and mathematics, I would say as well. And Renzulli also recognises the importance of task commitment here as well. That's a component of giftedness, the ability to stick at it, I suppose. Motivation, resilience, and things like that. I suppose we measure that in school to a degree, in two distinct ways. We do ascribe effort grades to what we deem to be a student's work ethic within a subject for subjects and so on. We must be wary of that though, as an indicator. It's just because a student doesn't may not demonstrate a high level task commitment in our individual subject at school, may not mean that he doesn't in other subjects, but may not mean that he doesn't outside of school in an area that's a passion of his as well. So a student, who doesn't necessarily demonstrate a high level of task commitment within school may still be, as far as we're concerned, gifted. Now, we do have also, quite useful as a measure for us, is the EI measures that many of our students have as part of the ongoing program with Swinburne University. Particularly, we found the managing and controlling emotions a strand of that indicator on that as being useful in give us an indication of capacity in terms of task commitment and so on. I'd talk about another student here, I think, who is an interesting example as regards these. Raf in year 10 is, in addition to our gifted register this year, he's not in the top 10 to 15% of ACER or Orwell testing, but he's a young man with a high level task commitment. He does programming and robotics particularly, and it's a skill that requires him to show an awful lot of creativity, and he does that at a very high level, and that would suggest that he would meet Renzulli's model, and he's a student that now is on our register. But it's not so much Renzulli's model as Gagné's DMGT that underpins our gifted policy, and I guess our identification of gifted students as well. There are a couple of key differences here that are significant and worth paying attention to and bearing out here. So yes, intelligence does appear, intellectual as a domain and so on. But there's and like Renzulli, there is also an acknowledgement of a creative domain is here. What is significant about Gagné's model here is that a student doesn't have to demonstrate a gift in all of these domains that we see on the left here. They can be gifted in just one domain as well. But it's interesting to pay attention to some of the domains that we may not characteristically associated with gifted students as much, if we're inclined to think in those old-fashioned terms of IQ. Social and perceptual are also mental domains as well, and we also have the physical domains, muscular and motor control, and so on. I'd like to think that in this school we have quite good provision for students who demonstrate gifts in those areas as well, but I'm not sure that we always necessarily identify them and recognise them as being part of a gifted program, I suppose, and we may need to consider that and think about that as well. The significant difference in this model is the distinction between gifts, which really are the natural abilities on the left, and talents, which are those gifts that have been transformed into competencies. They're on the right as well. And this perhaps leads us into that second part of the myth we've identified here, not that giftedness is synonymous with a high IQ, but it's synonymous with high attainment. We're often tempted to look, when we look for gifted students, at an indicator such as NAPLAN results or grade point average and say, well, here are our high attainers, they must be gifted. They often are gifted, but it's often the case that some of students we identify as gifted don't appear in those lists necessarily. They may not have transformed their gifts into those talents, those particular talents, and that high attainment. It's our job as a school, as kind of to provide an environmental kind of catalyst for them to be able to do that as well, and to help them to develop their interpersonal kind of traits that will enable them to make those transformations. But I think it's worthwhile pointing out here that under the Gagné model that we employ, high attainment is not always synonymous with giftedness. I want to move on to the second myth here, a myth that I think is widely still believed in many schools. I don't think I've encountered it as much as I have in other schools here as well. But I've certainly seen in my time in education an attitude that says, I'm paraphrasing here, but why should bright students and gifted be treated differently from other students? Curiously, I've never heard this attitude so much when it comes to those with special education needs, but when it comes to the gifted, I found an attitude at times that suggests, why are these kids entitled to special provisions? Often I think that's symptomatic of a belief that, these kids are bright, they'll be fine anyway, but regardless of whether or not that's fair, we do know that's not necessarily true. If we think about that Gangnam model, and I'm going to use an example of a student here in Year 8, Cameron, who is a student who probably we're not seeing consistently achieve high attainment at this point. His GPA is lower than many of his peers, and lower than the testing that we have of his ability suggests that it might be. Here is a student who we think that who has gifts that are not being transformed into talent. So it's just not fair and to say, oh, they'll be alright by themselves, these kids can sort them out because they've got the abilities. And I'm going to suggest that actually, if we refuse to acknowledge that gifted learners, and I think he may be an example here, are different in the way that they learn and the way that we need to provide for them, then we actually risk creating a cycle of unmotivated learners who consistently underachieve. So I think that's not good enough to say, they'll be alright by themselves. Let's pick apart these questions around fairness and equality. It's abundantly clear that in schools we don't see unequal outcomes as inherently unfair. This is what we do. It's the business of schools. The very fact that we grade and rank students is central to this. We say that if student X and Y receive the same curriculum, resources, support, attention, and student A receives an A and student Y receives a C, then so be it. That seems to be fair and meritocratic, because the missing ingredient here must be either natural ability or commitment, and thus the student gets what they deserve. Presumably then, when we talk about equality, we're not talking about equality of opportunity, but equality of opportunity. Look, it's kind of reductive to think about equality in this way. What we know of developmental psychology suggests that there may be a luck factor in the attribution of qualities like natural ability or commitment anyway. Ability is hardly ever innate. The child that receives a greater grounding of language stimulus in her early years is more likely to end up with a gift for English. The child who grows up in a family that values education is more likely to be hardworking. Gagne himself acknowledges the role that chance plays in the lottery of gifts, and as a catalyst in transforming gifts into talents. So fairness is problematic in the first place. Is it fair that a gifted child may receive certain genetic gifts, the benefit of hard-working parents who value education, the good fortune of good health? Probably not. But that is a question beyond the scope generally of us individual teachers at schools. What is true is that equal opportunity must entail equal support. Rogers tells us that research in the US suggests that 81% of teachers self-report that low-achieving students receive dramatically more attention than high-achieving students. Only 5% suggest that high-achieving students receive more time and attention. I don't know whether that's the case here. The obvious response is that, people are likely to say, these students don't need as much support. But I turn that back and say, they don't need as much support to do what? To pass the subject? Receive an A? Maybe not. But to truly reach their potential, however high that might be, they should be entitled to the same level of support to achieve their potential, just as lower ability students are able to. Hattie and others do raise objections to how gifted programs that focus on academic tracking effectively discriminate against those from ethnic minorities that historically underperform. Hattie incidentally also suggested the effect size for tracking is close to zero, so any segregation based on ability is morally unacceptable and unjustifiable, creates what he refers to as an educational apartheid. There are a number of responses to Hattie's claims about effect size and academic progress. But we won't get into that debate here. But let's talk about the fairness and segregation, because those are serious moral questions. In the context of our school, we do tend to track to ability group by attainment rather than ability, and this might have an impact on equity issues. How can we be sure that all of our gifted students are getting access to the opportunities we need? We do need, I think, to look at tracking where we do it by ability rather than attainment. And of course, this means that we need to have culturally unbiased indicators of ability. Well, Rogers reflects on research by Bloom that what we meaningfully need to deliver for students is challenge on a daily basis. Let's think about that for a second. That's problematic and difficult. Think of some of the brightest students we have in our school. We need to be challenging them on a daily basis. And when we do so, the effect sizes are a third to half a year's growth in attainment within a year. If we can meet that burden of providing challenge on a daily basis. So what is it the gifted students need? Bearing in mind it's a qualitative difference, not just a quantitative one. According to research presented by Rogers, whether it be in an add-on program or within class, better still in class, and we're all responsible for this as classroom teachers, we want to see curriculum modifications that enable things like this. A high level of difficulty and challenge. Abstraction, that's an interesting concept as well, dealing with abstract and conceptual thought. Stronger ties to human issues and problems. Concept-based organisation, particularly when that occurs across multiple disciplines as well. Strong links with methods practicing professional use as well. Good example, we took some students recently to work at QAMR labs, working on kind of professional kind of laboratory skills and so on. What else? Open-ended processes, higher order thinking, problem-based learning, inquiry strategies. Look, these are clearly things that we try to provide across the board for many of our students. But what the evidence clearly suggests, they have strong impacts on gifted students as well. Real-world problems, focus on real-world problems and taking things outside the narrow parameters of school, maybe applying our mathematical skills that we learn in class to real-world mathematical problems, finding real audiences for solutions, so having students have the ability to present to adults and professionals in fields that they're interested in as well. And perhaps this is kind of maybe some more traditional ideas about education as well. Just strong academic program, big ideas of science and maths, philosophy, general principles of art domains, multiple language learning. We can see these. Do our students have the capacity to investigate the classics of literature? We might ask ourselves that. How might we enable them to do so? And I'd like to finish off by looking at this third myth, which I think is a little bit more problematic in the context of this school, and something I think we need to consider. The acceleration of gifted students is harmful for their social and personal development. Let's begin by acknowledging that the academic benefits of acceleration are widely proven. There is little that we can do for gifted students that will benefit them as much in terms of developing their gifts into talents as acceleration. This comes from a meta-analysis by Steenberg and Moon, and it suggests that academic kind of benefits of acceleration are widely documented across a number of studies. In fact, of all the potential offerings we can make for our gifted students, the evidence suggests that acceleration is the most impactful. Rogers too has conducted meta-analyses of 314 studies that look at 12 distinctly different forms of acceleration, such as curriculum compacting, telescoping, subject-based acceleration. It found the most positive gains were in acceleration that involved grade skipping. There are similar meta-analyses done by Kulik and Kulik. All these testify to the academic benefits of acceleration, grade skipping in particular. So we're going to take that as a given and ask the question about why we don't really engage with this at this point in our school, why we don't actively practice grade skipping acceleration. I think we would probably acknowledge that we have a central concern here that it has a harmful impact on the social and personal development of these students. This is something that's very important to us in the school. We like to see ourselves as a holistic environment that will grow young men and secure their social and personal development. So I think we have an anxiety about separating them from their peer group. But I think before we move on, it's worthwhile considering, what do we really mean by a peer group? Does your peer group consist of students who happen to share the same birth year as you, or are they really those who share the same similar interest to you and are at a similar stage of cognitive development? I think it's worthwhile recognising here that in the context of a school like ours, we have vertical pastoral programs, we have a range of co-curricular offerings that enable people to maintain friendships with their age peers, even if they are separated with them and put into likability peer groups for acceleration. Even we have a number of things that mitigate against this in the first place, but the reality is that this concern about an anxiety that we have, and it's anxiety that is shared by parents, that grade acceleration is harmful for social and personal development, is a myth. Let's look at that in a little bit more detail. Here is research from Steenbergen and Hu and Moon again as well, across a number of studies. What does it show us? It shows us that rather than having a negative effect on social and personal development and well-being of young students, it has a marginally positive effect, a small positive effect. This has been shown across a number of studies. It's not enough to justify it on its own, this slightly small gain in social and emotional impacts, but put alongside the academic benefits, the growth in development of talents, then certainly it's not an issue. Let's dig down a little bit further and consider what we might actually mean by social and personal development, because that's quite a broad, vague concept. So Saylor and Brookshire here have broken this down a little bit. Here are two elements of what they see as being elements of social and personal development, and we would recognise that these are significant ideas. One is self-concept, one is locus of control, and you can see on the left there some statements. This is based on research that was done where surveys were given to students, gifted students and control groups, where they indicated and they self-identified themselves in those two, using statements like these in those two domains. What we find, if you look at the right here, is that students who have been accelerated, gifted students who have been accelerated, in terms of locus control, feel more in control of themselves and the way their life is developing than regular students by some margin, and also more so than gifted students who've not been accelerated. In terms of self-concept, those accelerated students self-score themselves significantly higher than their regular peers, their non-gifted peers, slightly less highly than their gifted peers who've not been accelerated. But this should assuage our fears that gifted students who are accelerated are losing something that their regular peers are gaining, and so on. There really is no evidence here. Well, we might say that maybe their self-perception is a bit diluted here, and maybe their peers view them differently rather than the way that they self-identify. Not true though, apparently. Again, if you look at this research from Saylor and Brookshire, what do we see? We see that the accelerated gifted students are viewed positively by their peers. They not quite as much as gifted students who've not been accelerated are necessarily, but generally speaking, more positively than their regular peers. I mean, there's nothing here to suggest a big black hole in terms of peer perceptions that makes them seem ostracized from their peer groups at all. They certainly don't underperform against regular kind of peers. Same in terms of behavioural problems. In fact, as regards on table 3 on the right, behavioural problems, those students, these are grade 8 students, by the way, those in the US, grade 8 students in the US, those students that have been, gifted students that have been accelerated are less likely to be in trouble for misbehaving. This is something that we would recognise as being a positive social and personal development than regular students, and also than gifted students who've not been accelerated. We would hope that part of the school experience, and certainly here, is about developing meaningful friendships and so on. This research again comes from the US. It concerns slightly older students who are in advanced programs in the senior years of schooling. What do we find? We find that those who participate in advanced coursework in English and Maths had friendship networks that were significantly larger than those that did not. And within those friendship networks as well, we also find that those that they are friends with students who are doing better in school and have a stronger sense of school belonging. So this sense that we are creating sort of social leopards by advancing them is unfounded. These students are perfectly capable of forming strong friendship groups when advanced. And I think this is a really telling piece of evidence, again from the US. This concerns students who've been accelerated, radical acceleration, and have entered college early. Now, what's interesting about this research is it's not asking students at the time they're in their school about their experiences. This is young adults who are either at university or in the first stages of their career, having been through this acceleration. This is from a program in Texas and so on. And what do we find? That students, in fact, 95% of students given that opportunity and having been accelerated early into college, 95% of them said, given the chance again, that they would repeat that choice and do what they did. And what we find about the students and their kind of general life satisfaction, as opposed to gifted students who were not offered that opportunity, we find them scoring slightly higher in terms of the way that they indicate their own personal well-being. So if you look at, for instance, their satisfaction with their achievement in life, their satisfaction with the standard of living, students who've had this opportunity to be radically accelerated actually are more satisfied with their life than those that haven't as well. Maybe this is something that we need to consider. I think one of the big questions we ask ourselves this year is, if we accelerate our students, what do we do with them when they reach year 12 and so on? Well, here is research that suggests that presuming these students are capable of coping with university early, and I've no doubt that we have many students who are, they actually end up being happier and having a high level of personal well-being as a result of this. So this should do an awful lot to get rid of this third myth that I think is still pretty pertinent within our school, that if we accelerate students, we are meaningfully harming their social and personal development. And the research suggests that this is just not true.